perspective influences everything. Perspective is going to be the first thing our audience interacts with. It's the connective outer layer, holding everything within our story together. Despite point of view sometimes being an afterthought compared to plot, setting, characters, and theme, point of view, I would argue, has the largest impact over all of those elements. Point of view will determine who the narrator is, it will establish the tone, and enhance the character development, the setting, and the tension overall. There's a sense of high risk and high reward when it comes to point of view. Use the wrong point of view, or break your point of view, and you'll run the risk of losing your reader entirely. But understanding the power behind perspective and maintaining a coherent vantage that consistently delivers information and builds empathy across your cast of characters will keep your audience engaged and hooked from start to finish. At its core, point of view refers to the vantage point from which your story is being told. And it's kind of funny, whenever I think of point of view or say POV, I always think of that 2008 film Vantage Point. And in a way, this film kind of gets at the heart of why point of view matters. Depending on who your point of view character is and which of the 4 point of view types you use, it could change how your story is seen and interpreted dramatically. And also, as important and common as point of view is, there are also a great deal of pitfalls that can break your story and make it confusing, or worse, unreadable. But before we talk about the issues and the problems with point of view, let's first break down what our point of view types are. I've spoken before about Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy and how his books are among my favorite, but are also a massive influence on my own writing. And he and his trilogy is really the perfect examination of point of view and the effectiveness of point of view. Just by talking about his books alone, we can see the breadth and the effectiveness of each of these point of views played out within one story. The Southern Reach trilogy covers and touches on every form, minus third-person omniscient. And it does kind of break the soft-ish rule of not changing point of view within your story, but we'll talk a little bit more on when we can break that rule and when we can't. To get an idea of what these point of view types are, let's look at an interview that Jeff Vandermeer had about his trilogy. Annihilation just came to me as a first-person journal account. In Authority, Book 2, which has elements of absurdism and office politics, the character John Rodriguez, or Control, is just taking over as director of the Southern Reach Agency. I felt writing his perspective in first person would be too close in, and he's already being overwhelmed by incoming information. And I needed the distance of third person to make that coherent for the reader. It also allows me, in a subtle way, to introduce elements, some uncanny, that John only half notices. In Acceptance, I used third, first, and second person because I had more characters' viewpoints, and it helped me make them clearly distinct from one another. It was for clarity for the reader. Second person I used because that point of view is almost like a framing eulogy or epiphany, and second person is very all-encompassing and powerful once you get used to it. First person point of view lets you really dive into the mind of the protagonist. You're sharing their thoughts and their feelings as they are coming to them. This can be a good way to share tension and build a deep understanding and empathy for that character. For the first person pronouns, we will use I, we, my, and our. Second person. This is probably the most uncommon amongst all of the point of views we can use. Usually the pronouns used are you, your, and yours, with the narrator directing the story to you, the reader. And then we have third person limited and third person omniscient. And we'll talk a bit about the differences between them. Next to first person, this is probably one of the most common that you'll see. The benefit of third person limited point of view is being able to broaden your cast, changing between primary characters' perspectives naturally. Most of the time, these changes will occur between chapters or books, but will maintain a coherent line of perspective within a scene. In third person limited, the narrator can reveal the thoughts, motives, and understandings of whoever the point of view character is at that time. The primary pronouns for this point of view are he, she, his, hers, they, and them. And then you have third person omniscient. This one is popular, though I don't think it's as popular as first person or third person limited. The difference, however, here is that third person omniscient is all knowing. The narrator knows everything happening within a scene and is not limited to one person's perspective. Personally, this is my least favorite of all of the point of view forms. I feel as if this takes away from the character's voice and straddles the dangerous line that can very easily spill over into head hopping. And then, of course, we can commonly hear the term the fourth wall, which might be a bit of a bonus point of view, though this does kind of neighbor second person. A book or written story won't necessarily always follow this, but usually breaking the fourth wall has to do with addressing the reader or addressing the audience. We see this happen more often than not in visual mediums. Depending on the genre or the age group that you're writing for, you can look and see which point of view is best to use for your story. It is important to understand the power that point of view kind of holds as well, as it will influence and inform the reader on all of the other elements of fiction that we've discussed before. We need to understand that the viewpoint we decide to use will be the conduit for the information that we want to share about the setting, the characters, the path of the plot, and the general themes. Point of view is one of those things that we tend to think of after we have already thought of either the concept of our story or the characters within it. But in reality, it's going to be the first thing the reader notices. Maybe not explicitly, but on a subconscious level. We need to understand who is telling the story, who is the narrator, and whose point of view matters. Getting the point of view right and using it to your advantage will help you in building conflict and tension, as well as establishing the tone of your story. There's nothing wrong with testing the different types, the different forms of point of view either. Sometimes what I like to do is if I'm stuck with a scene, is I will either change the point of view character or I will change the point of view entirely and see how that changes things. But the first few questions you might want to ask when you're thinking of your story and you're trying to decide on what your point of view is are, how many characters are you going to have? This question alone will sometimes help you narrow down and cross out some of these other points of view. What is the tone and what tense is the story being told in? This can also help you narrow down and cross out some of these. How broad is our plot and world? Is our point of view character new to this place too? Questions like this can help determine how we want our reader to feel and what role we want them to slip into, along with our characters. This will open the opportunity to either learn the world with our character or learn about the world from our character. And these can be two entirely different experiences when it comes to choosing what our point of view is. And that leads us to some of the things we should try to avoid when it comes to point of view. For one, we want to make sure we're not breaking point of view at any time within a chapter or a scene at worst. Switching from third to second to first to third and any other combination is a bit of a no-no. But if you're going to change the point of view type within your story, it's best to do those with specific characters and also after a chapter is concluded. Another thing we want to avoid is head hopping. This is something that is a personal pet peeve of mine, which is why I typically don't like omniscient point of views. Head hopping is when we go from one character's perspective to another's within a scene. This can be very jarring for the reader and can disrupt immersion as a whole. But there are also some specific pitfalls to each of the different point of views that we'll discuss a little bit that are also important to highlight. For first person, the reader is given a limited perspective, knowing only the protagonist's thoughts and feelings. We won't get an outsider's perspective or any other point of view while using first person. For second person, this requires a specific skill to pull off without feeling forced or cliche. It may not fit all narratives and is usually best done in small batches, sticking mostly to short stories or one-off chapters. For third person limited, there is usually a balance that needs to get struck between character depth and narrative scope. A pitfall here can sometimes be creating too large of a cast and having some of your characters lose agency of their own. And then for third-person omniscient, sometimes managing multiple characters' perspectives and maintaining cohesion within a scene can be a difficult thing to pull off. Also, we want to avoid the feeling of head hopping, so proceed with caution if you're going to be using this perspective. Understanding point of view and maintaining perspective is a bit like wielding the literary lens that shapes how your reader perceives the story. It is important to know the way we want this lens to point and also be aware of the pitfalls that come with each perspective. Point of view will help make the other elements of fiction coherent, keeping them also in place and under the same narrative voice. Point of view should not be an afterthought when creating your story. There needs to be a purpose behind the perspective that you're choosing, because at the end of the day, it's going to be that perspective that influences everything else.